This video is part 2 of a 2-part series on Trespasser. If you haven't watched my first video on why I think Trespasser is a great game, I would recommend that you watch that video first. The link is in the description. There you are again. I never thought the two of us would meet again. As I talked about in my last video, Trespasser is a very important game to me, and I feel that despite its flaws, it's well worth playing. I also know that many other people feel the same way. The game is still loved by a great deal of people, even though it came out over 20 years ago. There are entire YouTube channels and forums dedicated to the game. Since it is so beloved, it's strange that it hasn't had a remake yet. I know there are a few fan remakes that are already out or currently being worked on, but I think this game could really do with a proper remake. Today I want to talk about why I think now is the perfect time for a Trespasser remake, and aspects of the game that I think could be improved upon if a remake were to exist. So, without further ado, let's get into why Trespasser deserves a remake. Being a Jurassic Park game, Trespasser was originally released as a sort of tie-in to the movies during their peak in popularity. So seeing as the Jurassic World franchise has revitalized Jurassic Park, I think now, if ever, would be the perfect time for a remake. Remaking a beloved game during the second peak of the franchise would be incredible for sales, bringing old and new fans into the world of Trespasser. In this way though, a proper remake with the same story might not make the most sense. As much as I am not a fan of the Jurassic World movies, I feel like they would probably have to adjust the story to fit the context of Jurassic World rather than Jurassic Park. Perhaps a possibility would be to have it take place in between the first and second Jurassic World movies, having the player be stranded in what remains of the park before the volcano erupts in Fallen Kingdom, following the story of the development of Jurassic World rather than that of Jurassic Park. This may not be quite as interesting as the dinosaur trials and establishment of Jurassic Park explored in the original, but to have it make more contextual sense with the current state of the franchise, I feel like it might be necessary. Also, having just said that, if they were to take this route with it, maybe it would be more of a sequel than a remake, but regardless, I think it would be interesting to see. On top of that though, a true remake might not be fully possible without Richard Attenborough to voice John Hammond, so they would probably be required to do more of a sequel anyway. Either way they take it, proper remake or sequel, they would probably need to tie it to Jurassic World, making now, before the movie series finishes, the perfect time for it. Now would also be the time for a remake because of the incredible advancements in technology since the game's release. I know technology is going to rapidly get better every year, but I think we are at a state in which amazing things are possible in video games. As I mentioned in my last video, at the time of Trespasser's creation, systems and technology had to be invented to make the game work. Almost every video game these days has tech 10 million times better than the developers did at the time. Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but still, the technology available these days is so immense in comparison to what they had. The developers struggled to make a working advanced physics system for the game, which had almost never been done before, and now physics engines are incredibly realistic even in some of the lowest budget games. Just think about how large of a budget production companies would be willing to provide for a game that is almost guaranteed to be successful with modern technology. If a modern remake were to happen though, I think the control scheme would have to be changed entirely. It's clear from the original that the mouse and keyboard setup really wasn't right for the game. Yes, it could maybe be implemented better now, but I still think the game would function better in a different format. Using a controller would be a possibility if they really wanted to go for a similar idea with the arm mechanics. This would probably involve a similar system to that of the original, only mapped to a controller, which would maybe make it function and flow a little better. I think the best choice, however, would be to make it a VR game. I know VR is super expensive, so it would make the game less accessible, but I feel like it's the only realistic choice for a remake. The same mechanics from the original could still exist, just in a much more modern and functional way. Moving the arm with a VR controller and being able to properly manipulate held objects, like in any other VR game, would be so great for Trespasser. If they wanted, they could even scrap the idea of only using one arm. If it's not tied to the mouse anymore, but rather to controllers in both hands, why not make them both functional? Of course, if this were the case, they would need to rationalize how to make the game work without losing the sense of struggle. But I don't feel like that would be too hard if they limited the requirements of item usage. What I mean is that the player may have to use both hands to do a lot of tasks rather than being able to do separate things with each hand. For example, most guns would require both hands for use, and moving or carrying boxes would need both hands. It wouldn't be like many VR games in which the player can one-hand objects that wouldn't be realistic to do so with. There would need to be a certain dedication to making the mechanic realistic. Having said that, the player character, like in the original, should not be familiar with how to use weapons properly, and would be required to use them as such. Being VR would make the central game mechanic work properly. On top of that, I feel like VR would improve on the immersive aspects of the original game. It would bring a sense of danger and anxiety as you inhabit the character's shoes. To risk sounding like a game journalist, it would make you feel like the character, rather than like you are playing the character. VR would work almost too well for a Trespasser remake. There would also need to be some changes to the gameplay. I wouldn't want the game to lose its unique essence, but changes would definitely need to be made. Obviously, having a new control scheme and possibly being VR would change things a lot, but that's more about the basic functionality of the game. What I mean is that the game would need to introduce some new mechanics. Stealth is something that I think would benefit the game a lot. Not so much stealth that would be seen in games like Assassin's Creed or Sekiro, but rather something that requires you to be more aware of where dinosaurs are. Imagine if the dinosaurs could see and smell you, making you have to take advantage of sightlines and wind direction to avoid being noticed. You would have to maneuver around to gather items to fight them without being detected, rather than just relying on the wonky physics allowing you time to move. They would also have to change the way dinosaurs act and move to make them a real threat. Raptors would need to be intelligent and try to work as packs, and there would be next to no chance of outrunning them. T-Rex could use their size to force down smaller structures. Triceratops could be enraged to charge down groups of enemies. These are just some examples of a plethora of possibilities for dinosaur mechanics. Combat, of course, would need changes too. Guns would need to be more reliable and usable, which would probably happen regardless due to control and system changes, and they would probably need to be even more scarce than in the original. This would be made up for by having melee combat actually be functional. The player would have to spend more time hiding and avoiding fights, using melee weapons when necessary and using guns only as a last resort. Keeping the player limited on what they could carry, like in the original, would also add a lot to that sense of survival. And also maintaining no HUD would be beneficial to keep the game as a more immersive experience. I should hope that the game would still make use of the arm mechanic as its main functionality though. Without it, I don't think it would really feel like Trespasser. A remake would need to maintain the essence of the game while adapting to the modern world by adding new engaging mechanics. Another thing I would hope for in a remake would be to have more variety. The game could definitely use more variation in dinosaurs and weapons. If they're going more for a sequel or for a remake doesn't really matter with this aspect. Either way, the game could have more diversity in enemies. There are so many dinosaurs that could have potentially interesting mechanics if they were put in the game, rather than just having Raptor, and Biggest Raptor. Probably the most obvious example would be Dilophosaurus, which could spit at and temporarily blind the player. Baryonyx or Spinosaurus could attack while crossing a large river, creating aquatic encounters. Pachycephalosaurus could charge you if you get close or help by attacking predators that get near them. Again, these are just a few examples. There are so many options. As much as I think the weapon diversity in the original game is fine, I feel like they could do more to make the weapons feel different and possibly have different types be more effective in different situations. I think this would mostly be solved simply by having modern technology, but it would still be nice to see. Having more variety would keep the game from getting as repetitive as the original can. The last thing I want to talk about is story and structure. I already mentioned my thoughts on the story, but I think that regardless of their choice, having it set up in a similar way to the original is important. As I mentioned in my last video, I feel like the way the story is told in Trespasser is incredible, and I feel like it should be presented in the same way if they were to do a remake. I would much rather have them stick to that style than set it up as some grand cinematic story. I just think it works better for the game. For game structure, I would hope that they would keep it similar to the original as well. Having the game be split up into levels that are relatively open is super beneficial to the experience, and I would rather have that be maintained than switch to a very strict follow this path to watch a cinematic setup. The original did these things well, and I would hope that a remake would stick to that. As much as I would love to see this remake happen, my only concern would be that it wouldn't be made with the same passion that the original was. I think that's the main thing for me. Even though I mentioned all of these possibilities, keeping the game dedicated to maintaining the heart and soul of the original is most important. I do think that Trespasser could really use a remake though, and because of the technology and popularity of the Jurassic World franchise, I think now is the time for it. I may also have a lot of things I would like to see in a potential remake or sequel, but I think knowing that the game did get one, regardless of whether or not I personally liked it, would be fantastic. If it's not as good as I hoped, I'll always have the original. I think that Universal would be missing out on a huge opportunity if they didn't give it a shot. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The YouTube algorithm loves it, and I really appreciate it. I've started streaming now over at twitch.tv/chronogy. It took longer to get set up than I had hoped, but I've been trying to stream every 2 or 3 days. I'm still working out some of the kinks, but I've been having a good time with it so far. It's been pretty chill just playing some games I enjoy and talking about them, so feel free to stop by and hang out. Thanks again, have a wonderful day.